At 9:17 on a cold Thursday morning, a 15-year-old boy with rainwater running from his sleeves was dragged away from the side entrance of the Harrington Museum of Ancient Worlds. His name was Elijah Carter. To the security guard holding his arm, Elijah looked like trouble. His coat was too big, his sneakers were splitting at the sides, and the backpack on his shoulder was patched with duct tape. He had not shaved because he was too young to need to. He had not slept because the bus terminal had been too loud, and he had not eaten because the last $3 in his pocket had gone toward a library printing card. But inside that same museum, just 3 floors above him, 12 experts with doctorates were standing around a climate-controlled table, staring at a 2,000-year-old Egyptian manuscript insured for $200 million. They had spent 8 months trying to read it. They had failed. By nightfall, the boy they tried to throw into the rain would become the only person in the building who could tell them what the ancient text actually said. And the part nobody in that museum wanted to admit was this: Elijah had been trying to tell them the truth before anyone thought he was worth listening to. The Harrington Museum did not look like the kind of place that made room for boys like Elijah. It rose from the corner of 81st Street in polished limestone and bronze, with banners hanging from the columns and donors' names carved in letters that seemed more permanent than weather. Every morning, school buses unloaded children at the front steps, tourists took pictures beside the lion statues, and trustees arrived through the private entrance with umbrellas held by assistants. Elijah usually watched from across the street. He knew the museum schedule better than some of the staff. He knew the loading dock opened at 6:40. He knew the school groups came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He knew the free admission line moved faster after lunch when the morning tourists had already gone inside. And he knew that if he stood near the warm vent beside the education wing, nobody bothered him for at least 20 minutes, as long as he kept his head down and did not ask for anything. He had learned to survive by becoming unnoticeable, not invisible. That was different. Invisible meant people did not see you. Elijah knew people saw him. They saw the stains on his cuffs. They saw the torn canvas on his backpack. They saw the way he counted coins before buying a bottle of water. They saw him and made a decision before he spoke. Unnoticeable meant giving them no reason to act on that decision. So he read quietly. He moved slowly. He never blocked a doorway. He never sat on the museum steps unless the weather was dangerous. He never used the bathroom for longer than 5 minutes because he had been timed before. And when guards looked at him, he looked away first, not because he was ashamed, but because pride was expensive when you had nowhere to sleep. The strange thing was that Elijah loved the museum. He loved it with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. He loved the smell of old stone and floor polish. He loved the maps printed beside glass cases. He loved labels that could turn a broken bowl into evidence that someone thousands of years ago had eaten, worked, prayed, spilled oil, made mistakes, and still left a mark on the world. Most people came to see treasure. Elijah came to see proof. Proof that poor hands had built things kings took credit for. Proof that names could survive if someone cared enough to read them. Proof that a life could be buried for centuries and still speak. That morning, a new banner hung above the entrance. It showed a strip of darkened papyrus, its edges curled and cracked with lines of faded ink that looked almost like a secret whispered through smoke. The words beneath the image announced the museum's most important acquisition in decades. The Meridian Papyrus, a rare Egyptian manuscript believed to contain a lost religious text from the late antique period. The newspapers had called it priceless. The trustees had called it historic. The insurance documents called it $200 million. Elijah had first seen a photograph of it on a public library computer 2 weeks earlier. The image had been low resolution, compressed, and grainy, but he had stared at it until the librarian reminded him that his session had ended. He had gone back the next morning, and the morning after that, signing up under different guest slots when he could. He zoomed into the same strip of text again and again until the pixels broke apart. Everyone online said the script was Coptic. Elijah was not sure. That uncertainty had kept him awake under an overpass in a shelter hallway, and once in the back pew of a church that opened its doors during a freeze. The letters looked Coptic in places, yes, but the spacing was wrong. Some signs were squeezed too tightly. Some endings were clipped in a way that reminded him of trade accounts, not prayers. And there were marks near the margins that scholars on the museum's website had dismissed as damage. But Elijah had seen marks like that before in a scanned book about merchant shorthand from Roman Egypt. He did not have a degree. He did not have a bedroom. But he had a memory that held on to shapes the way other people held on to songs. He could remember the page number of a book he had read once 3 months earlier. He could remember the smell of the old dictionaries in the basement of the West 96th Street Library. He could remember the exact way a ligature leaned when a tired scribe joined 2 letters to save time. He had taught himself Greek alphabets from children's books, then Latin from discarded workbooks, then Coptic from a cracked grammar no one had checked out in 9 years. Later came Demotic signs, Syriac abbreviations, Hebrew roots, and whatever fragments he could gather from university PDFs that were supposed to be free, but often were not. He studied because libraries did not ask for rent. They asked for quiet. Quiet Elijah could give. Before his life fell apart, his mother used to call him her little archive. Her name was Lena Carter, and she worked double shifts in the cafeteria of a hospital where she could not afford treatment when she got sick. She used to bring home paper placemats from the diner next door and write words on them while Elijah ate cereal for dinner. Not big words, ordinary ones. Apple, river, window. But she wrote them in English, Spanish, and whatever else she could copy from library books, because she had a belief that languages opened doors, even when people closed them. When Elijah was 9, she bought him a used book called Ancient Scripts of the World from a sidewalk table for $1. The spine was loose. 3 pages were missing. Somebody had drawn a mustache on a photograph of a Babylonian king. Elijah treated it like a treasure. By 11, he could identify scripts most adults had never heard of. By 12, he was correcting mistranslated museum labels in pencil on napkins he never had the courage to hand to anyone. By 13, after his mother died and the apartment disappeared with a speed that still made his chest tighten, books became the one place where his life did not scatter. Foster homes came and went. A cousin took him in, then could not. A group placement lost his paperwork. A school marked him absent so many times that the absence began to look like his identity. Elijah learned which churches served soup without asking questions. He learned which subway stations stayed warm longest. He learned that adults often said the word help when they meant control, and the word policy when they meant go away. Still, every morning he went to the library. That was where he copied alphabets into the blue notebook with the taped spine. That was where he made columns of signs, roots, abbreviations, and guesses. That was where Miss Nora Wexler, the children's librarian, with silver hair and a habit of pretending not to notice his second breakfast from the community snack basket, quietly extended computer time when no one was waiting. Miss Wexler never called him gifted. She called him thorough. That meant more. The museum guard who grabbed Elijah that Thursday morning did not know any of this. His name was Frank Rowe, and he had been working security at the Harrington for 6 years. He was not the highest person in the building, but he had learned to protect the feeling of importance that came from standing between the public and things behind glass. Frank had rules. No loitering, no oversized bags without inspection, no sleeping on the property, no using the museum entrance as shelter from weather. The rules were printed, laminated, and posted near the door, which made them feel clean even when they were used in ways that were not. Elijah had not tried to enter through the main hall. He had stood near the side entrance under a narrow strip of roof-shaking rain from his notebook before it soaked through. His plan had been simple. Wait until the free admission hour, go inside, look at the public display connected to the Meridian Papyrus. Maybe if the museum had printed a larger excerpt of the manuscript on one of the wall panels, compare it with his notes. That was all. But Frank saw the backpack first, then the shoes, then the wet coat. He did not see a young scholar waiting for a museum to open. He saw a problem that might make donors uncomfortable. He stepped out and told Elijah to move along. Elijah tried to explain that he was waiting for public admission, but his voice came out too soft. Hunger can do that. So can the memory of being interrupted before the first sentence finishes. He held up the folded museum flyer from his pocket, the one he had rescued from a trash bin and dried under a hand dryer at the library. Frank did not look at it. He told Elijah the entrance was for staff and scheduled visitors. He told him there were school children arriving and that the museum could not have people hanging around. He used the word people in a way that meant only one person. Elijah said he understood, but asked if he could stand under the overhang until the rain slowed. That was when Frank reached for his arm. Not violently enough to leave a dramatic bruise, not gently enough to let Elijah keep his balance, just firmly enough to remind him that the sidewalk belonged to people who could afford to be believed. The blue notebook slipped from Elijah's hand and landed in a shallow puddle. Loose pages spread across the stone. A woman in a camel-colored coat stepped around them without slowing. A man carrying a museum badge glanced down, then away. One page stuck to the bottom of Frank's shoe until Elijah pulled it free with 2 fingers, leaving a gray smear across a chart of Coptic contractions he had copied by hand. Something changed in his face then. Not anger exactly. Anger would have taken too much energy. It was more like a door inside him closing. He gathered the pages, pressed them against his chest, and backed away from the entrance. Frank told him not to come back that day. Elijah nodded. Then he crossed the street and stood under the bus shelter, shivering, while the Harrington Museum opened its bronze doors to a crowd of people who would never be asked to prove they deserved warmth. 3 floors above, in the Walters Conservation Laboratory, the Meridian Papyrus waited under filtered light. The room was colder than the rest of the museum, not by accident. Temperature, humidity, air pressure, and light exposure were controlled minute by minute. The manuscript rested between layers of protective glass, surrounded by instruments, monitors, soft brushes, magnifiers, and people who had spent their lives earning the right to stand near fragile things. Dr. Margaret Sinclair stood at the head of the table with both hands folded around a pencil she had not sharpened in 2 days. She was 61, though sleeplessness had added years that week. As director of ancient languages at the Harrington, she had translated funerary inscriptions, monastic letters, tax receipts, temple inventories, and enough broken fragments to know humility better than most scholars. A broken text was not a puzzle waiting to flatter you. It was a person speaking through damage. That was why the Meridian Papyrus bothered her. It resisted every confident answer. The first line looked like Coptic, then slipped out of grammar. The second line seemed devotional, then used a number form more common in accounts. The third line contained what one expert insisted was a reference to a saint, while another argued it was a shipping marker. The margins carried tiny strokes no one could agree on. Were they corrections, damaged later notes, merchant marks, scribal practice? The museum's board did not care about uncertainty. They cared that the Egyptian delegation was arriving that afternoon. They cared that donors had been invited to a private evening presentation. They cared that the Harrington had promised a preliminary translation in the press materials. They cared that the papyrus was insured for $200 million, and that everyone expected the museum to unveil a discovery worthy of that number. In the lab, 12 scholars had gathered around the text. Some were generous. Some were tired. Some were quietly terrified. And one, Dr. Julian Price, had begun speaking more loudly every time his certainty weakened. Julian Price was the kind of academic who wore his credentials like armor. He had a doctorate from Oxford, a visiting fellowship in Berlin, a list of publications long enough to impress people who did not read them, and a talent for making disagreement feel like an insult to civilization. He had spent weeks arguing that the manuscript was a devotional Coptic text, possibly a lost homily, and he had promised the board that a polished translation would be ready. Now, with hours left, his polished translation had holes large enough for everyone to see. Margaret had been patient with him at first. She understood pressure. She understood ambition. But Julian had begun doing something she could not tolerate. He was forcing uncertain words into elegant sentences because elegant sentences made trustees feel safe. A line that might have referred to grain jars became vessels of grace. A phrase that might have meant payment received became blessing accepted. A mark that might have been a merchant abbreviation became decorative damage. Margaret knew the difference between interpretation and vanity. She also knew that if they presented the wrong translation to the Egyptian delegation, the mistake would not remain private. It would damage the museum's credibility, embarrass the scholars, and perhaps more importantly, misrepresent the person who wrote the manuscript in the first place. Ancient people had already lost their voices once. Margaret did not want to be part of losing them again. At 11:32, a lab assistant named Lila Morales entered with a tray of printed enlargements. Lila was 24, underpaid, overworked, and better at reading a room than most of the people with senior titles. She had seen the tension building all morning. She had also seen, through the narrow window overlooking the side entrance, a security guard shove a wet boy away from the door. She had noticed the notebook pages in the puddle. She had noticed because she had grown up in a building where eviction notices arrived folded into door frames like bad weather. She knew the body language of a young person trying not to be treated like a problem. But the lab was in crisis, and crises inside powerful institutions have a way of making suffering outside the window seem temporarily unrelated. Lila placed the enlargements on the table. One sheet slid from the stack and drifted to the floor near the door. It showed a magnified section of the papyrus, including the strange marginal marks on line 7. Nobody saw it fall except Lila, and before she could bend down, Dr. Price demanded another ultraviolet scan. The door opened. People moved. The sheet was nudged into the hallway. 10 minutes later, Elijah Carter found it. He had not meant to sneak into the museum. That mattered even if nobody later believed it at first. After Frank forced him away, Elijah had walked around the block to keep moving because standing still in wet clothes made the cold settle into his bones. Near the loading entrance, he saw a catering van arrive for the evening donor event. He also saw a stack of recycling bins beside the service door. On top of one bin lay a torn museum program, damp at the edges. Elijah picked it up because old habits are hard to kill. Blank margins could become notes. But as he reached for it, the service door opened and warm air spilled out. Then a sheet of paper skidded across the hall inside, pushed by the draft. Elijah saw the enlarged writing. For a moment, everything else fell away. The rain, the guard, the hunger, the rule that said he did not belong. He saw the marginal strokes clearly for the first time, and his mind did what it always did. It began sorting. Not letters, not decoration, not random damage. Tally marks, maybe. Account shorthand. A trader's hand mixing formal script with speed marks. He had seen a similar pattern in a scanned appendix from a book nobody at the library had opened since the binding cracked. His pulse changed. He stepped inside only far enough to pick up the paper. He told himself he would hand it to someone and leave. But the service hallway bent toward an elevator, and a group of staff members moved past him carrying crates of glassware. For 12 seconds, no one looked at him. That was all it took. Not because Elijah was a criminal mastermind, because buildings built to protect priceless objects often forget how easily a child can disappear through the spaces between adult assumptions. He followed the voices. The Walters Conservation Laboratory door was not fully closed. Inside, Dr. Price was explaining that line 7 contained a damaged reference to purification. Elijah stopped walking. His wet fingers tightened around the enlargement. He did not mean to speak. He truly did not. He had trained himself not to correct adults, especially adults in suits, especially adults who already sounded angry. But some mistakes press against the inside of the mouth until silence feels like lying. So from the hallway, barely louder than a breath, Elijah said, "It was not purification." The room went still. Every face turned. Frank Rowe, who had been called upstairs after a report of an unauthorized person near the service corridor, appeared behind Elijah almost immediately. His expression hardened with recognition. To Frank, this was confirmation. The boy had been trouble after all. He reached for Elijah's backpack. Elijah flinched but did not run. The enlargement trembled in his hand. Dr. Price looked from the wet sneakers to the patched coat to the paper and made the quick, fatal mistake that proud people often make. He mistook appearance for evidence. He asked who had let the boy in, then said the lab was not a shelter, and that security should remove him before he contaminated the workspace. The word contaminated landed harder than he expected. Even some of the scholars looked away. Margaret Sinclair did not. She was staring at the paper in Elijah's hand, and more specifically at the place where his thumb rested. Not over the image, beside it. Beside a cluster of marginal marks. His thumb had stopped there unconsciously, as if marking the exact problem they had been circling all morning. Margaret asked what he had said. Frank started to answer for him. Margaret raised one hand, not sharply, but with enough authority to quiet the guard. She asked Elijah again. He swallowed. His throat was dry. His clothes were dripping onto the polished floor, and 12 scholars were looking at him as if he were an interruption that had learned to breathe. He said the word was not purification. He said it was an abbreviated form connected to weighing or settling an account. He said the mark after it was not damage. It was a commercial sign probably indicating a partial payment or a recorded deficit. He said the line did not belong to a prayer. Then, because nobody spoke, he added that the text was not just Coptic. Dr. Price gave a short laugh. Not a happy one, a disciplinary one. He explained with the patience of a man performing patience that everyone in the room knew the manuscript contained irregularities. He explained that mixed scripts were not unusual. He explained that the boy had likely read a museum blog and misunderstood a photograph. Elijah lowered his eyes. Margaret saw it happen. Not surrender. Calculation. The boy was deciding whether being right was worth what came next. She had seen that same look in first-generation students, in junior researchers, in women at conference tables who learned to phrase discoveries as questions, so older men could repeat them as ideas. But she had never seen it this young or this tired. She asked Elijah his name. He told her. Elijah Carter. She asked how old he was. 15. She asked where he had studied Coptic. He hesitated, then said, the public library. A few people in the room exchanged glances. One scholar almost smiled. Frank made a sound under his breath. Margaret did not smile. She asked which grammar he used. Elijah named 3. Not just titles, additions, translators, the one with the bad index, the one that treated dialect differences too quickly, the one with the appendix on documentary hands that he said was more useful than the main chapters if you were looking at real writing instead of clean examples. The room changed by 1 degree. Not belief yet. Tension. Dr. Price felt it and stepped in quickly. He said this was absurd. He said they were losing valuable time. He said any bright child could memorize terminology online. He said the museum could not allow a trespasser to derail a formal, scholarly review. Margaret looked at Elijah's wet notebook still pressed against his chest. She asked if he could read the first 2 words of line 7. Elijah did not answer right away. He looked at the papyrus through the glass, then at the enlargement, then back at the papyrus. His lips moved once, silently, not theatrically, like someone counting steps in a dark room. He said the first sign had been misread because the scribe compressed the loop. It was not the beginning of a holy name. It was a shortened form of received. The next mark was a number, but not the number Dr. Price had printed in the draft. It was tied to a measure of grain. A scholar from Chicago leaned forward. Another reached for the draft translation. Dr. Price's jaw tightened. Margaret asked Elijah what the line meant. The boy's fingers stopped trembling. This was the strange mercy of knowledge. It did not care if your coat was wet. It did not ask where you slept. It did not ask whether your stomach hurt. For a few seconds, standing in front of the ancient text, Elijah was not homeless, not unwanted, not a problem at the door. He was simply reading. He said the line recorded grain received from the southern storehouse minus a portion owed to boatmen after flood damage. He said the next phrase referred to hands hired for carrying, not hands lifted in worship. He said the repeated mark in the margin meant the scribe was tracking debt across entries. Then he stopped as if suddenly remembering where he was. Nobody moved. Lila Morales, still standing near the scanner, looked at the draft translation on the table. The elegant sentence about vessels of grace had begun to collapse. Dr. Price said the boy was guessing. Margaret asked Elijah to turn away from the papyrus. He did. She covered the enlargement with a folder and asked him to write the signs he had just described. Frank objected. He said the boy had already caused a security breach. Margaret told him that the breach would be reviewed, but not before she understood what was happening in her laboratory. That sentence would later be repeated often, though never in the official minutes. Elijah placed his wet notebook on the edge of a side table. The cover left a dark rectangle on the clean surface. Lila quietly slid a stack of absorbent pads beneath it before anyone could complain. Margaret handed him a pencil. Not a pen, a pencil. Scholars trust pencils because they admit correction. Elijah drew the signs from memory. He did not draw them beautifully. His hand was stiff from cold, and one fingernail was split. But he drew the compressed loop, the clipped ending, the diagonal accounting mark, and the little cluster that everyone else had dismissed as damage. Then he wrote 3 possible expansions beneath them. Beside the second one, he added a question mark. That question mark did more to convince Margaret than confidence would have. A fraud tries to sound certain. A reader leaves room for the text. For the next 20 minutes, the lab became a place nobody had expected. Not a museum, not a courtroom, not a shelter, but something more fragile than all of them. A room where status and truth were no longer perfectly aligned. Margaret tested Elijah carefully. She gave him a different line, one without the marks he had first noticed. He identified 2 Greek loanwords buried in Coptic endings. She gave him a fragment from the ultraviolet scan. He said one sign might be a place abbreviation, but he would need to compare it with the margin. She asked about a symbol near the top that Dr. Price had called a cross. Elijah said it could be a cross, but in this context, it behaved like a check mark in an account column. That line made one of the papyrologists cover his mouth, not because it was funny, because it was plausible. Dr. Price tried to regain control by asking Elijah to parse a formal Coptic sentence from memory. Elijah did. Then Julian asked for a dialect distinction, expecting him to stumble. Elijah answered with the title of the book where he had learned it, then added that the book's example was too clean for the papyrus on the table. The room heard it. Too clean. That was the problem with Dr. Price's translation. It was too clean, too graceful, too eager to turn a working document into a sacred one because sacred texts sounded better at donor receptions. The Meridian Papyrus was not less important because it contained accounts. It might have been more important. Kings had left monuments everywhere. Priests had left prayers. But ordinary systems of trade, labor movement, debt, and survival were harder to reconstruct. A merchant's shorthand could reveal routes, names, prices, shortages, repairs, relationships between communities, and the daily machinery beneath official history. Elijah understood that instinctively, maybe because he knew what it meant to be counted incorrectly. By 1 o'clock, Margaret had ordered lunch into the lab, though Elijah ate only after Lila placed a wrapped sandwich near him and looked away, giving him the dignity of not being watched while he unwrapped it. He ate half too quickly, then forced himself to slow down. People who have gone hungry learn to hide hunger almost as carefully as they hide fear. His notebook had begun to dry in uneven waves. Margaret asked if she could look at it. Elijah's hand moved toward it before he could stop himself. That notebook held years of work. It held copied alphabets, shelter addresses, phone numbers that no longer connected, a recipe his mother had written on the back of a clinic reminder, and a list of books he wanted to read if he ever got stable access to a university library. He did not want strangers touching it. Margaret understood before he explained. She said he could keep it in his hands and show her only what he wanted, so he opened it. Page after page changed the air in the lab. There were charts of Coptic abbreviations, Greek numerals, demotic signs, shipping terms, temple titles, notes on scribal habits, and little warnings to himself in the margins. Do not force the pretty translation. Check if same mark means measure. Bad scan, find better. Look for trade context. Ask Miss Wexler if interlibrary loan possible. On one page, Margaret saw the same cluster of marginal marks from the Meridian Papyrus. Elijah had copied them from the low-resolution public image and written beside them, maybe merchant account, not prayer. Need closer view. The date was 11 days earlier. Margaret looked at that date for a long time. Dr. Price saw it too. That was when his attitude shifted from dismissive to dangerous. It is one thing for powerful people to ignore someone they consider beneath them. It is another for that person to become evidence that they were wrong. A mistake can be corrected. An exposed arrogance has to defend itself. Julian began speaking less about the text and more about procedure. Who was this boy? What was his educational status? Had anyone verified his identity? Could the museum legally allow a minor into a restricted conservation space? Was there a liability issue? Could his presence compromise the chain of custody? Was the institution prepared to explain that an unknown homeless teenager had handled internal research materials? Each question sounded responsible. Each one moved attention away from the translation. That was how institutions often protect themselves, not by saying the cruel thing directly, but by surrounding decency with paperwork until it runs out of air. Then Victor Harlan arrived. Harlan chaired the museum's board of trustees and wore a navy suit that seemed tailored not only to his body, but to his belief that rooms should rearrange themselves around him. He had made his money in private equity, donated enough to have a gallery named after his family, and considered the museum a temple of civilization, by which he meant a place where wealth could appear tasteful. He had been told there was a problem in the lab. When he entered, he did not look first at the papyrus. He looked at Elijah. That look contained the whole story before a word was spoken. The wet shoes, the patched backpack, the sandwich wrapper, the security guard, the annoyed senior scholar, the other experts hovering between embarrassment and fascination. Harlan asked why a street kid was in a restricted laboratory. Nobody had called Elijah that yet, not out loud. The phrase landed cold. Elijah folded the sandwich wrapper with careful fingers. Margaret said Elijah Carter had identified a serious error in the working translation. Harlan looked at her as if she had answered a different question. He said the delegation from Egypt would arrive in less than 2 hours. He said donors were already confirming attendance for the evening. He said the museum had reputational obligations. He said whatever this was, it needed to be handled quietly. Handled. That was the word people used when they wanted a person turned back into an inconvenience. Margaret told him the translation they had planned to present was wrong. Dr. Price interrupted. He said that was premature. He said the boy had made some interesting observations, but the manuscript required professional evaluation. He said his team could incorporate anything useful into the final interpretive notes. Anything useful. Not Elijah's name, not Elijah's work, just anything useful. Lila heard it and looked down at the table. Elijah heard it too. He had heard versions of that sentence all his life. Adults taking the useful parts. Schools taking test scores but not attendance barriers. Agencies taking forms but not calls. Strangers taking his mother's story and turning it into a lesson about resilience while never asking what she needed when she was alive. Margaret's pencil snapped in her hand. Not dramatically, just a small crack in the room. She placed the 2 pieces on the table and told Harlan that the museum would not steal a child's work in front of her. The silence after that was different from the earlier silence. Earlier, people had been surprised. Now, they were choosing sides. Harlan's face tightened. He said nobody was stealing anything. He said the museum had protocols. He said a 15-year-old with no credentials could not be credited as a principal translator on a $200 million artifact because he wandered in from the rain. Margaret said he had not wandered in from the rain. He had been pushed into it first. Lila looked up. Frank Rowe shifted near the door. Harlan did not like where the sentence pointed. He said security issues would be reviewed later. For now, the boy needed to be escorted to a waiting area while qualified staff completed their work. Elijah closed his notebook. It was a small motion, but Margaret noticed the finality of it. He was used to leaving before he could be removed, used to protecting the last thing that belonged to him by taking himself out of reach. She turned to him and asked if he wanted to continue. No one had asked him what he wanted all day. The question almost undid him. He did not say yes immediately. He looked at the papyrus. He looked at the scholars. He looked at Frank. Then he looked at Margaret, trying to determine whether her kindness was strong enough to survive the people around her. He said he wanted the translation to be right. That was all. Not credit. Not money. Not revenge. Right. Margaret nodded once, as if that answer had settled something. She told Harlan that if the museum presented a known false translation, she would withdraw her department's approval in writing before the delegation arrived. Harlan stared at her. Margaret had spent 31 years building a reputation for caution. She had never threatened the board in public. She had never needed to. Her seriousness had always been quiet enough for powerful men to underestimate. Not that day. The board chair stepped into the hallway to make calls. Dr. Price followed him. Frank remained near the door, watching Elijah with the stiff resentment of a man whose first judgment was becoming inconvenient. For the next hour, Margaret and 3 other scholars worked with Elijah line by line, not as a stunt, not as charity, as scholarship. Elijah did not translate perfectly. That mattered. He stumbled over damaged sections. He revised himself. He admitted when a sign could have 2 meanings. He asked for a better image, then asked whether the infrared scan could separate overwritten ink from surface staining. He misread one abbreviation, then caught his own error when it appeared again later with a number beside it. Each correction made him more credible, not less. Real reading is not a lightning bolt. It is pressure, patience, and the willingness to be embarrassed by the text until the text begins to trust you. By 2:30, the outline had emerged. The Meridian Papyrus was not a homily. It was a ledger letter, a hybrid document created by a trained scribe working under pressure, probably during a period of flood disruption and trade interruption. It recorded grain shipments, labor payments, temple storehouse withdrawals, boat repairs, and a chain of obligations between communities along the Nile. But woven through the accounts was something far more human than numbers. Names, not royal names, not the names museums usually put on banners. Boatmen, porters, widows receiving ration grain. A disabled copyist paid half rate, then corrected in the margin by someone who insisted he be paid in full. A group of workers identified not by title, but by the phrase, "those who carried the house of memory." Margaret leaned closer when Elijah reached that phrase. He explained that it probably referred to people transporting texts, perhaps from a damaged archive or temple library, during flooding or unrest. The manuscript was tracking the cost of saving documents, not holy poetry, not abstract doctrine, a record of labor used to protect knowledge. The room was quiet when that became clear. The irony did not need to be spoken. A homeless boy had been thrown away by a museum. On the same morning, he revealed an ancient record about workers paid to carry memory through danger. Then Elijah found the line that changed everything. It was near the lower edge where the papyrus had darkened and the ink thinned into brown shadows. The scholars had treated it as nearly unreadable. Dr. Price's draft skipped it entirely. Elijah asked for the multispectral image. The technician brought it up on the monitor. He stared for so long that Harlan, who had returned to the lab with 2 board members and a legal advisor, began to lose patience. But Margaret did not rush him. Elijah traced the air above the screen without touching it. He said the line was not part of the main account. It was a note by the same hand squeezed into the bottom after the ledger was finished. A warning, maybe, or a plea. He worked through it slowly. The scribe had written that the value of a storehouse is not in the sealed room, but in the hands that know how to open it. Then came a phrase that made Margaret remove her glasses and rub the bridge of her nose. "Do not refuse the carrier at the door." At first, nobody spoke. The sentence was not mystical. It was practical. It may have referred to workers carrying documents, or messengers owed food, or laborers who had preserved the archive and needed access to the storehouse they had helped save. But in that room, after that morning, it felt impossible to hear it only as an ancient administrative note. "Do not refuse the carrier at the door." Elijah looked away first. He did not want the room's pity. Pity had a way of making people feel generous without making them fair. Then the Egyptian delegation arrived. They were led by Dr. Samira Naguib, a papyrologist and cultural heritage official with a calm face and eyes that missed very little. She entered with 2 colleagues, a legal representative and the kind of diplomatic courtesy that can detect panic through walls. The museum had prepared a welcome table downstairs, but Dr. Naguib had asked to see the manuscript immediately. Harlan tried to manage the moment. He greeted her warmly. He spoke of partnership preservation, shared heritage, and the privilege of stewardship. He did not mention that 90 minutes earlier, he had tried to remove the person now standing beside the monitor with a pencil behind one ear. Dr. Naguib listened politely. Then she asked to hear the preliminary translation. Dr. Price stepped forward. That, too, was a choice. He had spent the last hour arguing that Elijah's observations should be incorporated into the team's work. Now, in front of the delegation, he began presenting a revised explanation, as if the shift had emerged through normal scholarly refinement. He acknowledged the possibility of administrative elements. He spoke smoothly about hybrid documentary form. He used the phrase, "Our team has identified," 3 times in 4 minutes. Elijah stood near the side table silent. Margaret let Julian speak just long enough for the pattern to become visible. Then Dr. Naguib asked about the marginal marks on line 7. Dr. Price answered confidently, too confidently. He said they were secondary account notations, indicating a deficit in grain owed to transport workers. That part was correct because Elijah had said it. But then he added that the notation supported his broader reading of a symbolic ritual economy tied to temple purification. Elijah's head lifted. Margaret saw it. So did Dr. Naguib. She turned to him, not to Dr. Price, not to Harlan, to the wet-haired boy in the oversized coat. She asked what he thought. Harlan's mouth tightened. Dr. Price began to object, but Dr. Naguib did not look away from Elijah. There are moments in a life when a door opens so quietly that you can miss it if you are too busy expecting another wall. Elijah stepped closer to the monitor. His voice was still low, but steadier now. He said the marks did indicate a deficit, but not a symbolic one. The scribe repeated the same deficit structure in lines 9, 12, and 15 each time after a transport entry. The pattern showed actual payment adjustments after flood damage. And the phrase Dr. Price connected to purification appeared beside a boat repair term in the lower section, which made a ritual reading unlikely. He paused. Then he said the manuscript was not using temple language to describe trade. It was using trade language to describe the rescue of temple or archive property. Dr. Naguib's face changed. Just slightly. She asked him to repeat the last part. Elijah did, then showed her the line about those who carried the house of memory. One of her colleagues opened a folder and removed a photograph of a different fragment held in Cairo, not yet widely published. He placed it beside the digital image. The room leaned in. The fragment contained the same phrase, those who carried the house of memory. For 8 months, the Harrington team had studied the Meridian papyrus as if it were alone. But the Egyptian delegation had brought evidence that it belonged to a wider archive. They had suspected it, but the Harringtons' early description as a devotional text had not matched their parallel fragment. Elijah's reading did. Dr. Naguib asked where he had trained. The room waited. Elijah said he had trained mostly at the public library. This time, nobody laughed. Dr. Naguib looked at the notebook in his hands. She asked if she could see the page where he had copied the marginal marks before entering the lab. Elijah glanced at Margaret. Margaret nodded, but only as permission to choose. He opened the notebook himself and held it out. Dr. Naguib studied the page, then the date, then the question marks and cross-references. Her expression remained controlled, but her voice softened when she said his method was careful. Careful? It was the same kind of word as thorough. Elijah held on to it. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a way the museum could not fully control. Dr. Naguib asked Elijah questions, real questions, hard ones. She challenged his expansions, asked for alternatives, pressed him on damaged lines, and listened as he explained where he was certain and where he was not. Margaret contributed. 2 other scholars joined, honestly. Dr. Price tried to re-enter the center of the conversation, but the center had moved. Truth has a way of doing that when it finally finds enough witnesses. By 5 o'clock, the museum had postponed the donor presentation. By 5:15, Harlan had called an emergency board meeting. By 5:30, the legal advisor had quietly asked Lila to collect all drafts, notes, and attribution records connected to the Meridian papyrus translation. That request mattered. Because Dr. Price had already sent an updated summary to the board office listing himself and Margaret as principal translators, Elijah's name appeared nowhere. Not even in the notes, not even as an outside contributor. The summary referred vaguely to new comparative observations raised during review. Raised by whom? The document did not say. Lila found the omission before Margaret did. She printed the email, placed it in a folder, and wrote the time across the top. That small act became one of the hinges of the story. Not everyone can stop an injustice when it begins, but someone can preserve the evidence. Someone can refuse to let erasure look like confusion later. At the emergency meeting, the polished language returned. Risk, liability, optics, donor confidence, minor status, unauthorized access, chain of custody, institutional reputation. Elijah sat outside the boardroom with Lila holding a paper cup of water he had not drunk. His clothes had dried badly and smelled faintly of rain paper and city pavement. Through the wall, he could hear raised voices, though not the words. He expected to be removed any minute. That expectation lived deep in him, deeper than hope, deeper than disappointment. It had been built by shelters at capacity, schools that could not find his records, agencies that transferred him to voicemail, and adults who praised potential only when it arrived wearing the right shoes. Lila sat beside him and asked if he had anyone to call. He shook his head, then remembered Miss Wexler at the library. He almost gave Lila the number, then stopped. He was afraid that involving the librarian would get her in trouble for letting him use resources too often, or for knowing more about his situation than she had reported. That was how homelessness traps young people, not only through lack of shelter, but through the fear that any help might set off a system they cannot control. So Elijah said no. Lila did not push. She only slid a museum hoodie across the bench and told him the lab kept extras for staff who worked near the cold storage rooms. It was navy blue with the Harrington logo on the chest. Elijah looked at it for a long time before putting it on. Inside the boardroom, Margaret Sinclair did something she had not done in her entire career. She made the issue impossible to soften. She said Elijah Carter had identified the core structure of the Meridian Papyrus after the senior team had misclassified it. She said his prior notes proved independent analysis. She said the Egyptian delegation had confirmed his reading against a parallel fragment unavailable to the Harrington team. She said any publication, press release, donor presentation, or scholarly report that failed to credit him would be knowingly false. Harlan said she was being emotional. Margaret replied that she was being precise. Then Lila's printed email entered the room. Dr. Price said the omission was temporary. He said attribution could be handled later. He said the boys' contribution, while interesting, had occurred under irregular circumstances. He said scholarship required standards. Dr. Naguib, who had been invited to join the meeting as a representative of the lending authority, spoke then. She said standards were exactly the issue. She said the manuscript itself recorded the labor of people who preserved knowledge, while higher status figures likely received the honor. She said it would be a remarkable failure of interpretation for the Harrington Museum to repeat the same erasure while presenting the text to the world. That sentence ended Julian Price's control of the room, not his career in a single thunderclap. Real consequences rarely arrive that neatly, but it ended the version of the story in which he could quietly absorb Elijah's work and call it institutional scholarship. The board voted to delay the public presentation by 48 hours. The translation team would be restructured. All notes would be reviewed. The museum's legal department would coordinate with child advocates to ensure Elijah had representation before signing any agreement. Dr. Price would be removed as sole lead on the translation, pending an internal review. Harlan resisted the last part. Then Dr. Naguib made clear that the Egyptian delegation would not endorse any announcement that excluded Elijah's documented contribution. That settled it. Institutions sometimes discover their morals only after their partnerships are at risk. It is not the purest path to justice, but for people like Elijah, even imperfect justice can open a door that had been locked for years. When Margaret came out of the boardroom, Elijah stood too quickly. He was bracing. She saw it and slowed down. She told him he was not in trouble. The words did not land at first. They were too unfamiliar in that setting. She said the museum needed to apologize to him, properly, in writing. She said his translation work would be credited. She said there would be adults brought in whose job was to protect his interests, not the museum's image. She said if he wanted to leave, he could leave. If he wanted to stay involved, he could, but not as a curiosity and not as charity. Elijah listened without blinking. Then he asked about his notebook. Margaret looked confused for half a second, then understood. Through everything, the notebook was still the thing he feared losing. She handed it to him with both hands. The gesture was small. It was also the first time that day someone returned something to Elijah as if it were valuable. That evening, while donors drank sparkling water downstairs and whispered about the postponed presentation, Margaret drove Elijah to the public library on 96th Street because it was the only place he said he trusted. Miss Nora Wexler was still there, shelving returns in the children's section. When she saw Elijah enter with the director of the Harrington Museum, wearing a museum hoodie over clothes that had clearly been soaked, her face changed in a way that made Elijah look at the floor. Some adults make concern feel like accusation. Miss Wexler did not. She simply asked if he had eaten. That question nearly broke him. Over the next 48 hours, the story became larger than Elijah wanted. There were meetings with child welfare advocates, education liaisons, museum attorneys, and a youth housing organization that Margaret already supported, but until then had never needed to call for a child standing in front of her. There were forms. There were careful conversations about consent, guardianship, school enrollment, safety, and compensation. There were moments when Elijah shut down completely because too many adults were asking too many questions in rooms with closed doors. Margaret learned quickly that helping was not the same as taking over. She made mistakes. She used institutional language when plain language would have been kinder. She assumed once that a shelter placement was automatically good news, and Elijah had to explain with visible effort why some beds were not safe for every kid. She apologized, then listened better. That mattered. Because Elijah did not need to be rescued like an artifact from a ruin, he needed people to stop treating his survival as proof that he required no care. On the second day, the museum held a private scholarly review with the Egyptian delegation and selected outside experts. This time, Elijah sat at the table from the beginning, not at the head, not as a symbol, as a contributor, with his notebook open, a pencil in his hand, and an advocate seated nearby to make sure the room remembered he was 15. The revised translation was cautious but strong. The Meridian Papyrus documented emergency logistics during a flood season that threatened stored texts and goods. It showed how local workers, scribes, boatmen, and storehouse keepers coordinated the movement of materials between communities. It preserved names and payment records that could help scholars map networks of labor trade and knowledge preservation across a region often discussed only through elites. And at the bottom, in the cramped line that had nearly disappeared, it preserved the warning Elijah had found: do not refuse the carrier at the door. The phrase became the heart of the museum's announcement, not because it was sentimental, because it was accurate. Dr. Naguib confirmed the translation publicly, while making clear that ongoing research would be shared with Egyptian scholars and institutions. Margaret credited the team, then named Elijah Carter, as the person who had identified the manuscript's hybrid commercial structure and corrected the original classification. There are moments when a name changes shape in public. For years, Elijah Carter had been a name on missing school forms, shelter intake sheets, and library guest passes. A name called by adults who expected him to move along. A name attached to absence risk and inconvenience. Now it appeared on the first page of the preliminary translation record. Elijah Carter, contributing translator. He stared at the printed document for so long that Margaret wondered if he had found an error. He had not. He was looking at proof that nobody could fold into a pocket and throw away. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Frank Rowe was placed on administrative leave while the museum reviewed security footage and visitor access policies. He later returned in a different role after required training, though he never again worked the side entrance during youth programs. That consequence disappointed some people who wanted a cleaner punishment and angered others who thought he had done nothing wrong. Elijah said little about it. When asked privately what he wanted, he did not ask for Frank to be ruined. He asked that no child be pushed into the rain for standing near a museum door. He asked that security staff be trained to contact outreach workers instead of treating homelessness as trespassing. He asked that public admission actually mean public. Those requests became policy, not overnight, not perfectly, but they became written rules with names attached and budgets assigned, which is how compassion survives after the emotional moment passes. Dr. Price faced a different kind of reckoning. The internal review found that he had attempted to circulate revised findings without proper attribution after Elijah's contribution was documented. It also found that his earlier translation had overstated uncertain readings for public presentation. He did not vanish from academia. Men like Julian Price rarely disappear because of one failure. But he lost leadership of the project, issued a formal correction, and withdrew from the museum's lecture series. For someone who had built his identity on being the voice in the room, losing the right to narrate the discovery was its own justice. Victor Harlan's apology took longer. At first, he tried to write it the way powerful people write apologies when they are negotiating with consequences. He regretted the situation. He regretted any misunderstanding. He regretted that Elijah felt unwelcome. Margaret sent the draft back. Dr. Naguib sent it back. Lila, who had no formal power but had earned more moral authority than half the board, wrote one sentence in the margin. He did not feel unwelcome. He was refused. The final apology used the word refused. It also used the word wrong. Elijah read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it inside the back cover of his notebook, not because it healed everything, but because some documents matter when the world has spent years pretending your injuries were too vague to record. The museum created a paid junior research fellowship around Elijah's role, but Margaret insisted on doing it carefully, not as a publicity decoration, not as a child prodigy exhibit. Elijah would work limited hours, with tutoring, housing support, counseling access, and a clear educational plan. He would not be paraded in front of donors every time the museum needed to feel redeemed. This was harder than a single generous announcement. It required scheduling, money, legal review, transportation, a quiet place to sleep, a school plan flexible enough to repair years of disruption without treating him like a broken machine. It required adults to coordinate when coordination was boring, not only when cameras were present. The youth housing organization found him a room in a supervised transitional home with a desk by the window. The first night, Elijah did not sleep in the bed. He sat on the floor with his back against it because beds in new places did not feel safe yet. The second night, he slept on top of the blanket. The third, he opened the notebook and copied the line from the papyrus in careful letters. "Do not refuse the carrier at the door." Under it, he wrote his own translation note. "Sometimes the carrier is carrying more than you think." Months passed. The Harringtons' revised exhibition opened without the old spectacle. The banners changed. The marketing team wanted to put Elijah's face everywhere. But Margaret refused most of it, and for once, the board listened. The exhibit focused on the workers named in the manuscript, the complexity of documentary texts, and the shared research partnership with Egyptian scholars. Elijah attended the opening in a borrowed blazer that did not quite fit his shoulders. Miss Wexler came too. So did Lila. So did 3 students from a shelter-based tutoring program who had heard that the museum was now offering open study mornings for young people without fixed addresses. They stood near the display case, reading the label that described how a manuscript, once mistaken for a religious text, turned out to preserve the labor of ordinary people who saved a house of memory. Elijah's name was on the label, not huge, not decorative, there in the same font as the others. That was enough. A donor asked him how it felt to be a genius. Elijah looked uncomfortable and said he mostly felt behind in algebra. Lila laughed first, then Margaret, then Elijah a little. It was good for people to hear that. Talent does not cancel the practical damage of instability. A brilliant child without housing still misses homework, loses documents, gets sick, ages too quickly, and learns to read adult moods for survival. Elijah's gift had not protected him from homelessness. In some ways, it had made the neglect around him more painful, because he could understand exactly how many systems were failing at once. That became part of Margaret's public message whenever she was asked about him. She refused to let people turn Elijah into a comforting exception. He was exceptional, yes, But he was not evidence that hardship creates brilliance. Hardship had nearly buried brilliance where no one would find it. The miracle was not that suffering made him strong. The miracle was that it did not destroy what was already there. And Elijah was not alone. As his story spread, people began asking how many young people were living with gifts nobody had time to notice. The numbers were not gentle. Public school data in the United States had identified more than 1.5 million students experiencing homelessness during the 2023 to 2024 school year. Federal point-in-time counts found hundreds of thousands of people homeless on a single night in January 2025, including more than 250,000 living unsheltered. Youth homelessness researchers and policy groups have long warned that roughly 1 in 30 teenagers, ages 13 to 17, experiences some form of homelessness over the course of a year, and many are hidden from official counts because they move between couches, cars, shelters, stations, and unsafe temporary rooms. Those numbers are too large to imagine all at once, so people often do not imagine them at all. Elijah gave one number a face. But the point was never that every homeless teenager is secretly able to decode an ancient manuscript. That is not how human worth works. A child should not have to be brilliant to deserve shelter. A boy should not have to save a museum from embarrassment before adults decide he is worth feeding. A young person should not need to translate a $200 million artifact to be treated as more valuable than a wet footprint on a lobby floor. That was the uncomfortable truth beneath the inspiring one. The museum had not discovered Elijah's worth. It had discovered its own blindness. 1 year after the morning at the side entrance, the Harrington launched the House of Memory Initiative. The name came from the papyrus, but the work belonged to the present. The program opened museum study rooms twice a week for students experiencing housing instability. It provided transit cards, meals, tutoring, library access, quiet workspace, and paid internships that did not require applicants to have perfect attendance records or permanent addresses. Miss Wexler helped design the reading list. Lila became the program coordinator. Margaret taught the first seminar herself. She began with ordinary documents, receipts, letters, account lists, fragments of daily life. She told the students that history often survives through paperwork other people considered unimportant. Then she asked them what kinds of records modern society misunderstands. A girl in the back said, eviction notices. A boy said, bus transfers. Another said, absence slips. Elijah, sitting near the window with his notebook open, wrote that down. By then, he had started school again through a flexible program that combined tutoring, online coursework, and museum-supported independent study. It was not easy. People liked the clean version of his story where the homeless boy solves the manuscript and steps directly into success. Real life moved slower. He had panic in crowded rooms. He hoarded food in his desk drawer until his counselor helped him understand why. He sometimes disappeared emotionally when adults argued. He struggled with math assignments he could not charm his way through with ancient languages. But he kept going. He passed exams, then more exams. He gave a short presentation at a youth scholarship event and hated every second until a younger student asked him how to learn Greek letters, and suddenly he forgot to be nervous. He co-authored a scholarly article with Margaret Dr. Naguib and 2 other researchers because Margaret insisted that co-authorship should reflect labor, not age. He spent a summer in a Columbia University pre-college program where he called Miss Wexler after the first week and admitted that everyone seemed smarter than him. She told him to find the library. He did. Years later, when Elijah Carter received a full scholarship to Columbia, the headline writers returned. Homeless teen who cracked ancient code wins scholarship. Museum prodigy heads to Ivy League. Boy, once kicked out, becomes scholar. Some of the headlines were true enough. Some were too neat. They made it sound as if one dramatic day had lifted him cleanly out of the life before it, as if trauma were a coat he could simply take off once someone handed him a better one. Elijah knew better. He carried both lives. On move-in day, he packed lightly because he still did not trust abundance. 2 bags, 1 box of books. The blue notebook now held together by archival tape Margaret had given him as a joke and a blessing. Inside the back cover were the apology letter, a photograph of his mother, a library card, and a copy of the first translation page bearing his name. Margaret drove him to campus. She tried not to cry and failed in a dignified way that made Elijah pretend to look out the window. Before he got out of the car, she handed him a small envelope. Inside was a museum ID badge, expired now, from his junior fellowship. Across the front, under his photo, were the words, "Research Assistant." Elijah smiled. He said he had never liked that picture. Margaret said, "Nobody likes their badge picture." Then she told him something she had been waiting years to say. She told him that the day he entered the lab, he had not just helped translate a manuscript, he had translated the museum to itself. He had shown them what their own mission meant when it was no longer safely behind glass. Elijah did not answer right away. Then he said his mother would have liked that. Not because it was grand, because it was useful. On campus, he found the library before he found the dining hall. That surprised no one who knew him. In the years that followed, the Meridian Papyrus continued to reshape scholarship in small, serious ways. Researchers used it to understand labor networks, emergency preservation, and the movement of texts through communities under pressure. The phrase, "those who carried the house of memory," appeared in articles, lectures, and eventually on the wall of the Harrington's Education Center. But for the people who had been there that first day, the manuscript's most important line remained the one at the bottom. "Do not refuse the carrier at the door." It became a rule. Not a slogan, a rule. At the Harrington, security training changed. Staff learned how to contact youth outreach teams. Public spaces were redesigned so free visitors did not have to pass through invisible tests of belonging. The museum partnered with libraries because Elijah kept reminding them that libraries had been doing the work long before donors noticed. Paid internships no longer required references that homeless students often could not provide. The side entrance where Frank had grabbed Elijah's arm was fitted with a small bronze plaque, not with Elijah's face, but with words from the translation. "The value of the storehouse is in the hands that know how to open it." People walked past that plaque every day. Some read it, some did not. That was all right. Not every lesson announces itself loudly. Sometimes it waits beside a door until the person who needs it finally looks down. Elijah returned to the museum often during college. He was taller then, though still thinner than Margaret wanted. He had better shoes. He still carried snacks in every bag. He still noticed exits in every room. Healing did not erase habits that had once kept him alive. One winter morning, during a public study session, he saw a boy standing near the education wing with a backpack held together by red string. The boy was pretending to look at a map while watching the snack table from the corner of his eye. Elijah recognized the performance immediately. The careful distance, the false disinterest, the math of hunger disguised as politeness. He walked over, not too fast. He did not ask the boy where he lived. He did not ask why he was there. He did not turn kindness into an interview. He simply pointed toward the table and said the granola bars were for everyone. The boy shrugged as if it did not matter, then took 2. Elijah looked away while he put 1 in his pocket. A few minutes later, the boy drifted toward the display case where a replica of the Meridian Papyrus was shown beside the translation. He read the first lines, then leaned closer when he saw Elijah's name. He asked if that was him. Elijah said, yes. The boy asked if he was famous. Elijah thought about it. Then he said he was mostly busy. That answer seemed to satisfy both of them. The boy pointed at the ancient line on the wall and asked what it meant. Elijah looked at the words he had carried from the worst morning of his life. into every room that came after. Do not refuse the carrier at the door. He could have explained the historical context. He could have talked about flood logistics, documentary, Coptic, commercial, shorthand, scribal compression, and the ethics of attribution. He could have given the kind of answer scholars give when they are trying to prove they deserve to be standing beside the glass. Instead, he gave the answer he wished someone had given Frank Rowe before the rain started. He said it meant you should be careful who you turn away, because sometimes the person at the door is carrying the thing you most need to save. The boy nodded, as if that made sense. Then he asked where the library was. Elijah showed him. And that is where this story really ends. Not with the scholarship, though, that mattered. Not with a museum job, though, that changed Elijah's life. Not with a public apology, the corrected translation, or the powerful people forced to say his name. It ends with one overlooked boy showing another overlooked boy where the books are. Because talent can live anywhere. It can sleep under a station clock. It can copy alphabets beneath a library lamp. It can stand outside a museum in wet shoes, holding a notebook nobody has bothered to read. It can be quiet, hungry, guarded, and still brilliant. But talent is not enough if every door is built to reject the person carrying it. So the next time you pass someone, the world has trained you not to see. Remember Elijah Carter. Remember the 12 experts who had every credential except the answer. Remember the guard who saw a threat where there was a scholar. Remember the woman who paused long enough to ask one more question. And remember the ancient scribe writing at the bottom of a damaged page across centuries of dust and pride and locked doors, a warning we still have not fully learned. Do not refuse the carrier at the door.